And you want to turn to the books of Samuel, that's exactly where we're going to be tonight in our series on the former prophets. We're making pretty good headway here. I've been feeling pretty good about the progress that we're making. If you've been following along on the timeline that I gave you, that little handout that showed you the Old Testament story or the history in that timeline, we've been covering this period that you see up there in orange that is dealing with this specific period we're covering in the historical books of the Old Testament. Now, we already covered Joshua, obviously, and then last week I had the opportunity to talk to you guys about Judges, and we're moving forward in that, and tonight we're going to be looking at 1st and 2nd Samuel. That covers those areas there in blue that you would see in between. It picks up right at the end of the period of the Judges and moves forward until right before we get into the life of Solomon. So in that little blue zone, that's the period of history that we're going to be talking about tonight. In one night, I'm going to cover the two books, both 1st and 2nd Samuel, and I'll talk to you about why that would be. Originally, just so you know, this was one book, and it was probably written on two scrolls because 1st and 2nd Samuel are about identical in length, and they pick up, the second half picks up exactly where the first half leaves off. So really what we have in 1st and 2nd Samuel is one book that's been broken in half. In the Jewish studies, they keep it together. We've split it. You know it as 1st and 2nd Samuel. I'm going to cover it just all in one night tonight. Just so you know what you're looking at, in the book of 1 Samuel, we're going to deal with the period of the last judge. You remember last week I talked to you about the judges and who they were and what they did and so forth. And then we're going to talk about the rise of the monarchy. So that ties right back into that handout with the timeline that I talked to you. So Israel's come through this period from Moses, obviously, we've talked about that, to Joshua, to the period of the judges, and now they're moving forward into their history, and they're about to establish a king to rule over them in a united monarchy. And so we're also going to see the big story. We're going to see a lot of things, but ultimately it is the story or the introduction in 1 Samuel to David, King David. And so in 2 Samuel, the entirety of that book really deals with his reign. So from the time of him coming in to actually sitting on the throne in Israel to right before his death is covered in what we know as 2 Samuel, or the second half of the book. And then right in the front half, I just thought it'd be smart to tell you guys like who Samuel was or why do we have it. Samuel is not the author of the book of Samuel, but rather he is the key character in there. Pretty early into what we know as 1 Samuel, Samuel dies. So obviously Samuel himself is not writing all those materials, the things that go on all the way leading up until the reign of Solomon. And so it's named after Samuel because the key figure, key role that he was in this transitionary period in Israel's history. I hope that makes sense to you guys. Samuel is an interesting character, and if you've read it, you know this. He serves in a multitude of roles. He serves in the role of a prophet, and he serves in the role of a priest, and he also serves as the last judge or the final judge over Israel. So remember that judges period that we just talked about is these guys that would come at critical moments, critical times in the history of Israel. The Lord would send a deliverer to them, or what we would call a judge, and he would come as a military leader, really, and lead them back out of oppression from their enemies and deliver them according to God's will and purposes. And so the cool thing about Samuel, the role that he plays in this period of history, is that he is the guy that anoints the first two kings over Israel. So both Saul and David are anointed as king at the Lord's bidding by Samuel himself. Okay? So with that being said, let's look at the area specifically. You guys know how I like to do is just give you the background. Here in this 55 minutes that we have to do this, there's no way for me to cover in detail the things that are going to happen. You need to do that. I stress this every week. I'm going to continue to do that until Jesus calls us home. The reading of the scriptures is your responsibility. I'm providing you the tools and resources for you to be able to understand it when you go back into it. And I stand here to answer any questions that you may have once you've done so. But if you're skipping the reading, then you're shortchanging yourself of the blessing. And so I encourage you to do that. So here's some things that you might not immediately pick up on if just by the straightforward reading itself. If you'll remember, when we left you in Judges, Israel had been divided into their tribal areas, and that handout I gave to you, it was the color map with all the different tribal areas assigned to it. I think there's still a few of those available at the Info Center if you lost yours or you never got one. Hopefully they have those there while supplies last. But when I left you there, the way that this was set up, the nation or the people of Israel, the Israelites, are divided into their assigned tribal areas, and they're set up in little regions with a localized government, right? And so there was a ruler over various tribes, the tribal elders that we talked about last time. The central worship of Israel was happening in a city called Shiloh. And you can see it up there on the screen. You also see it on your map if you brought that with you tonight. Shiloh was a centrally located city. That's where the tabernacle was set up, the tent. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was most of the time. And that was the location of the religious festivals and feasts and places where all the various tribal peoples would gather together at least once a year, probably multiple times a year, that they would gather together for their festivals at Shiloh. And this was a period of God's deliverers, these judges that would come to rescue them according to the needs. And then I talked to you last week, too, about all the different Canaanite problems that they had. And so the Canaanites, if you remember, is every non-Israelite that's living in that region of Canaan, the land of Canaan, is a Canaanite. So here, as we're moving now away from that, I forgot that was even like that. You have to bear with me here. All right, there we go. You're going to see some major shifts, but what I would call tectonic shifts. And so in the way that the religious life or the cultural life of Israel has transpired up until this point is about to change dramatically during this period that we're reading about in the books of Samuel. And so whereas you've seen what I just described for you as becoming now a way of life for them for multiple generations. Remember, it's over 200 years that have transpired now that they've been living in this period of judges. So for generations and generations and generations, that's all that they've ever known. The people, the Israelites that walked across the desert are long gone. That's great grandma and grandpa, okay? This is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years into the future from that time frame when they crossed the Red Sea and all that kind of stuff. So now they've settled into a way of life that I've just described with their tribal regions and so forth, but things are going to change. In three big ways it changes just in these couple of books of Samuel. Number one, their worship is going to shift. We're going to move it out of Shiloh, that city that I showed you, and they're going to move south a little bit into the city of Jerusalem, which is, of course, where it stays up until this day. And so you're going to see that shift take place as it begins to set up. And the method of leadership. So whereas at one point, they had Moses. At another point, they had Joshua. At another point, now they've had generations and generations of judges that would lead them at key points. Now what you're going to see is a centralized kind of government begin to come together, and it's going to shift away from the judges and into a monarchy. Okay, we don't sometimes understand monarchy in the United States because we don't live in one. This is a kingdom. All right, we can think of maybe Great Britain and their king. All right, this is Israel and their king. So this is a kingdom and a monarchy. And so there is a supreme ruler, this king, who's David. But we all know, we've already seen and talked about that really the true ultimate leader of Israel is not David. He's not the hero here, but it's God himself. All right. Also, the government position is the way I should say that for Israel is going to change here as you go through those particular books. Where they were tribal areas with tribal leaders, they're going to come together now as one united kingdom of Israel. And so as a united kingdom, rather than them individually as tribes trying to forge their own way and make an existence and continue to stand against their enemies. You remember what I told you, that they didn't have a standing army, that each tribe kind of had to fend for itself, and when enemy attack would come, it would come against that individual tribe, wherever they were trying to get in. This is different now. We're going to shift to a time frame where it is a united kingdom. It is a single people group. Israel, the Israelites, not the tribal region of Benjamin or Judah or Manasseh or so on and so forth as you go through there. Okay? Now the advantage of that for them from just a real world, I guess, standpoint would be that they have the ability then to establish themselves as a genuine and legitimate economic and military force in that region. And that ultimately is what's driving them to want to become a united kingdom to begin with, and I touched on that a little bit last week. But look for those things, okay? So those are the three big shifts that are going to happen here in that period of time. Their worship is moving from Shiloh to Jerusalem. The leadership is going to change from judges to a king, and their government is going to change from 12 individual tribes into one centralized, unified kingdom. Now, I want to talk about the Philistines a little bit. And these would be counted among the Canaanites. And the Philistines are a people group that were troublesome, to say the least, for the people of Israel living in this time frame, okay? They're the bad guys. The Philistines they live, you can see the area down there sort of in the bottom left of your map in Philistia, is where they were headquartered, if we want to say it that way. And I told you that what they had to deal with in Israel were these enemy attacks, because there's all these people around about and internally that were living in that land when they moved into it. So they've had to fight to establish themselves in the area to begin with. And the real deal here for the fighting, it's not like they're fighting just for religious purposes or because they don't like their God. They're fighting for practical purposes, all right? This is just like could have happened yesterday kind of stuff that's happening in this world, all right? They're struggling to provide land for families. They're struggling to provide land for themselves so they can make a living, all right? Not just Israel, but the Canaanites, the other ones that are out there. And they're fighting for control of territory that will provide for them a survival, really, ultimately, because it's if I can get the best piece of land, then I can have the best farm. If I can grab a plot of land that happens to have a trade route going through it, then every caravan that goes through, I can stop it like an ogre, right? Thou shalt not pass. You got to pay your toll if you want to go through my land. And so if you're going to drive through my land, then you're going to pay me a tax. And so if I can get a foothold or a stronghold or establish myself around these military or rather trade routes, then I can secure a living for me and my family and their family after them and so forth. So this really, it's like a matter of survival from their perspective. It's just to get an advantage. It's to place myself militarily in a point that has a strategic advantage so that if somebody else were to try to take my land, I've got the upper hand, so to speak. Does this make sense to you guys? So this is what's going on. The struggle and the battle that's happening here is for these key areas. They want the places where they're going to have the trade routes. They want the places where they're going to have the strategic advantages. They want the places that has the greenest grass, right? The grass is always greener on the other side. And so these are the fights that are happening here as other people are trying to claim the territory that the Israelites themselves are claiming, because God said, hey, it's yours. The difference between the Israelites and the rest of them is like God owns the earth. It's his. He owns it. He's the deed holder. So if God says it's yours, he can do that. You see what I'm saying? So God has given them this land, even though they have to do their part in order to get it. So I wanted to talk about, if you see on there, on that left side, you see where I say the sea peoples? And you may even see that referred to as you're going through and you're doing your reading, the sea peoples. These are people that came from where? The sea. All right. And so to put this in perspective, because it gets misleading, we can forget sometimes where that sits on the bigger map. And I just I'm going to back it up a little bit so you can see the sea peoples came from the sea, the Mediterranean Sea to be exact. And archaeologists and so forth, anthropologists have done great work in our era. Listen, anthropology and archaeology can help biblical studies. That's how I'm able to give you the historical background that's not in the book. Amen. That's how I'm able to give you this information that helps you to understand the book so we can inject ourselves into the world that they lived in. So the sea peoples that were coming in to attack or to claim land were coming from across the Mediterranean Sea, and they were coming from various areas and countries for the very same purposes that I've been talking about here, to establish themselves, to snatch up the land that's going to provide them the greatest amount of resources and so forth. Now, you're not real familiar, probably, most of us are not real familiar with what's happening globally. As Christians in church environments, we hear about certain pieces of it, but we're not like aware of what's happening all around the world. So obviously here, we talked a lot about Egypt, right? So you see where this area we're talking about. But Egypt, the Egyptians, they're a major superpower, right? Okay. And their enemy is to the north. It's the Hittites. That's a big clash. Now, we talk about Egypt a lot. We don't talk about the Hittites a lot because they haven't been relative exactly to our conversation. But in this period that we're dealing with, if you remember, I told you last week, Egypt itself is not at its strongest point. So they're not able to truly establish themselves in this region like the Roman Empire in the future will ultimately do. All right, so technically, they're kind of loosely in control of this area. And the Hittites up to the north are loosely in control of their area. And there's sort of a ceasefire, like a no-fire zone, a treaty that's come in between the two. And sandwiched right in the middle is Canaan, this area that we've been talking about, which then ultimately leaves the people who live there, it's like a free-for-all. That's why we're seeing all this activity going on when everybody's trying to grab up land, because there is no military saying, behave yourself and stay in your spot. You know, like, shut up and color. They're not there to do that. Now, with those two primary powers in place, but sort of in the ceasefire area, there is another group that ultimately, now this is way off into the future, ultimately will become the Greek Empire. Greece at this time frame on the other side of the Mediterranean is going through the same kind of things that Canaan is in the area that we've been talking about. And by that, here's what I mean. There's a bunch of city-states that are there. All right, so it's a tribal sort of existence over in Greece. Now, this is going to make sense to you in a moment. Why are you telling me this? They're in this competition for survival and the acquisition of land to be able to preserve themselves into the future. And so these guys who are in the situation where we're not the dominant major world power, but we're trying to gain a foothold, are becoming adventurers, if you want to think about it that way, but probably more accurate to say they've become raiders. They've become what we might call sea peoples because they're pirates. That's very good. That's a good one. But pirates, in my head anyways, I always think they like just stay on the ocean, right? No, these guys are going, they're going to go along the coast and try to snatch up land. Now, why is that smart? Because the trade routes run along the coast. Amen? All right. So, out of this area in Greece, now I've zoomed up towards the Greek area, and I know this is really hard to see, but I'm going to help you. There's like Athens, Greece is right around there. You've heard of that, right? Corinth is a port city. There's a channel that cuts right through Corinth. And so like the letter to the Corinthians is written to that area. Paul spent a lot of time there, like hundreds of years, like 1,000 years from now. But this is, Athens is there, and Corinth is there, and this city called Pylos is there, which is really important in a minute, and I'll explain it to you. And then also, just to help you kind of understand, even though they're tribal, don't think that they're unsophisticated, because this is also where Sparta is. Y'all heard of Sparta, right? How many of you guys have seen the movie The 300? All right, we are Sparta. Now, that's going to happen much later in history, but this is where it's birthed out of. And so when I talk about the sea peoples, we're talking about these tribal warrior pirate raiders who are trying to establish themselves and are moving to establish a foothold along trade routes for their own security and survival ultimately, okay? And so here's the deal. Out of this area, there's a group of people that moved into the area we've been talking about. Everybody still tracking with me? They go into Canaan, and they establish themselves and become the Philistines. Everybody tracking so far? Where do the Philistines come from? They're the raider, pirate, outlaw, bandit people from Greece. All right. Now, this is generations before the area in history we're talking about right now. In the time since they moved into there, they've done some stuff. All right. First thing that I want you to know, where they came from, and the reason I told you that city Pythos that you're not familiar with was important, is because that was the center in Greece for metal workers and armorers. So what were their major trades? Making weapons and armor. Everybody here? Greece, cultural center, headquarters, weaponry, and armor. Once they got into Canaan, they assimilated. And by assimilate, it's like a melting pot, okay? After a little while living in a particular culture, you start to take on some of their similar things. It's what God warned the Israelites about over. Do not become like the Canaanites when you get there. Do not worship their gods. Do not follow their ways. Okay, that's assimilation. That's the process of becoming like the local people. So these guys coming across assimilate into the land of Canaan. They begin to adopt the same thing, including the same language. And so now, as a few generations have gone by, they're still carrying those trade skills. They're still armor makers and metal workers. And they're now they speak the language, and now this is their home, and now they've assimilated that territory. And when they got there, or since they've been there, the first thing that they did is they established 3 city, or rather coastal city-states. Coastal city-states. Now, this is the same area. I just turned it for you a little bit. This right here is the Dead Sea. Okay, there's the Jordan River, and that's the Sea of Galilee up in that corner right there. The Philistines, when they came over, the sea peoples, they established 3 cities right there. Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. They're on your map. And the reason I put this up here is so that you can understand why those 3 cities become important. Number 1, their proximity to places like Shiloh and Jerusalem inside of Canaan. Now see, we look at it on a map all the time, and y'all forget there's a lot of mountains in that area. So right on the other side of the hill from Jerusalem are these 3 Philistine cities. And the major trade route in between Egypt, running up through Canaan into the Hittite territory, Lebanon and so forth, runs right through those 3 cities. So you have a group of military raiders trained in armor making and metal working who have come and assimilated into the area and established 3 cities along a major trade route. Now that should tell you they're funded. They're well funded, well cultured, well trained, and well equipped. The city, or this pathway here runs right through there, right along the coast. You hear sometimes you'll read the Bible and it says they went from place A to B by the way of the sea. And we read that today and we say, oh, so they walked along the ocean. No, they took I-75 north. As far as it goes 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. All right? This is a major road. And so we just have to expand like the way we think. Sometimes we forget. They traded goods internationally and had taxes and services and militaries. Right, is this just making sense to you guys? I just want you to understand that it's still there. You can drive down that road today. All right. Hey, look at that. So if you own this, or if your city, like your choices are, go through the mountains with your caravan, Good luck with the thieves. Or pay my tax. What you going to do? Pay the tax. It's just the cost of doing business. All right? So this is how this worked. There were established trade routes already in existence. All right? International trade that's happening here. And right in the middle of that, here's where we are. Those 3 cities. And then they expanded, added 2 more, Ekron and Gath, and had it was a pentopolis is what they call it. Pentagram, right? 5. A pentopolis, 5 city-states or 5 capital cities in a league together under Philistine control. Is everybody, are you still here? All right. This is important to you if you actually read the book. If you actually read the book, keep your map handy as you're reading it and track along and understand this is what's going on. I explained to you, Goliath came out of Gath. He was the champion of Gath, a Philistine warrior, right? That's a big deal. Why did David gather 5 stones? It's a great mystery. Why did David gather these 5 stones? He only needed 1. Because they had 5 cities and 5 kings and theoretically 5 warriors. Everybody here? All right. The mystery of the 5 stones solved. Now, the Philistines had something else that Israel didn't have, and this is important. They had, ready for this? This is a deep one. Iron. This time frame that we're talking about happens to be in the exact transition between the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. Those 2 things are overlapping. The new technology, the new technological breakthrough of this area or era is iron. Everybody okay? If you have a sword made out of bronze and I have a sword made out of iron, which one of us, all other things being equal, is going to win? Iron, because it's harder and it's stronger. Bronze is soft. Iron is hard. It's a superior weapon. It's a superior metal. That's why we make things out of iron to this day, okay? Here's the thing. The Philistines came from the center for metalworking. They were early adopters of it. They probably were among the peoples that developed the technology. They're living in this area of Canaan, and their metal workers are continuing to hone their skills and make iron weapons. And guess what? It's not in their advantage to share the technology with the enemy. Is everybody here? I know it's cold and wet out there, so here's the deal. The Philistines were the group of people living in the area with the ability to forge iron, which gave them the advantage in weaponry because they could make superior weapons. Sometimes when you're reading the story and they're making a big deal about their spears or their swords or their chariot wheels for that matter, to the people living in that area, they're going, oh yeah, they got the best ones that are around. See, the big deal with like Goliath's spear is not just that it was big, it was that it was iron. The big deal with David cutting off Goliath's head with what? Goliath's sword is that Goliath's sword is iron. So David getting his hands on Goliath's sword is kind of like, I don't know, capturing a Russian MiG. Not that we would do such a thing. You understand? This is it's what we do today. Militaries trying to acquire weaponry that is superior and developed other places to to reverse engineer. So when David cuts off Goliath's head with Goliath's sword, David has his hands on a piece of technology that's like a really big deal. It's not because it's a big sword as much as it's because it's an iron sword. Y'all gather, you're tracking with me? David killing Goliath with a sling and a rock is a statement bigger than you thought it was. Because the big deal that's being said here from a theological standpoint, David anointed by the Lord, doesn't matter that they have iron weaponry, whereas the Israelites are still using bronze. David can pick up a rock off the ground and a shepherd's sling and kill their greatest warrior under the anointing of the Lord. Do you see what I'm saying here? It's a bigger deal than we would think or real. Yeah, of course, a sling and a rock, that's a big deal as it is. No, it's a bigger deal than that because they're at a technological and a military disadvantage. And here in the story of David Goliath is the story of you're the trained military, you're the armor makers, you're the metal workers, you're the ones with superior weapons and technology. I'm a shepherd boy from the backside of the desert or backside of the woods, and I show up here with lunch from my brothers, and I will take out your greatest warrior with a rock and a sling. You don't stand before. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that would defy the armies of the Lord? You see, I told you when they were under Joshua's command and they were taking the land, it was the Lord that gave them the land. It wasn't because of their military might or their superior power, and it never, ever, ever will be. It's always the Lord's anointing over them that gives them just like in your life. Look, I could preach this tonight if I wanted to, and I kind of want to. You could be in it. What's your disadvantage? What don't you have that somebody else has? What are you using as your excuse not to? I can't, I would, I could, I should, I would, but I just can't, I can't reach it, I don't have this, it doesn't matter. When the Lord's on your side, He's blessed you and anointed you and called you. If he's given it to you, you can take it. Amen. There's too many of God's people that are cowering in the corner going, oh my God, she's really big. And here comes a 13-year-old boy like, who's that? Give me a rock. I'll take care of this right now. All right. So here's your Philistines in a nutshell. They're the major enemy of Israel during this time frame. You'll read over and over. Trained military force. They're highly developed with a monopoly on iron. They have well-planned cities that are well located, and they're prosperous from trading and the taxes that they get from the trade routes. That is a formidable enemy. It's not equal. By world standards, it's not equal. Just like David and Goliath, those are metaphors for the nations. The Philistines and the Israelites. David and Goliath. Everybody here? Okay, good. All right, let's talk about the religion again. I touched on this a bit last week, but now we're further along, and so I want to hit it just one more time. As you know, in Canaanite religion, there's a lot of gods. What you might not know, I didn't tell you last week, is they actually have a ranking, an order, a hierarchy of the gods, if you will, a pantheon. All right? So here's the way it worked for those guys. The Canaanites were real big on ancestor worship. So like if your ancestors died, you would offer them offerings. You know, like you have a little something you light a candle for them, and you leave them, some Cheerios and a bowl of milk, and so that they have stuff, like you give them as offerings. If you had an ancestor that was royalty, if he was the tribal leader, he was the king or whatever, then he was deified. Once he died, there was this big funerary procession that they would go through that was the act of that royal ancestor becoming one of the gods. And so they were the ones that were like, above all for us we worship this family deity, that I'm from the lineage of King so-and-so, the god over this region, so on and so forth, okay? Next on the hierarchy, there was Dagon. And you'll see his name in there as you're going through and read. He was the national deity of the Philistines, okay? He was, in their stories, he didn't have a creator. There was no creation account of him. He just was. And most of the scholars think that he was the god of military battles. All right, so he was the god of military victory. Doesn't it make sense then that the Philistines would acquire, like, that's going to be our national deity? Dagon, in their worship, had a son, and that son was Baal. And I touched on Baal a little bit. Baal was the son of Dagon. He's the most popular of the Canaanite gods, a god of fertility, a god of storms, king of the deities. But he would, and this is what I touched on last week, he would manifest himself locally so that every city, if every one of these tables represented a city, then I would manifest myself as a different god there, and a different god there, and a different god there. And so it was the god of that table, or the Baal. Baal of that table, the Baal of that table, the Baal of that table, the Baal. And so different identity, different individuality, but a manifestation of this king of the gods ultimately. I told you that they would pair them off, male and female pairs, because of the association that they had with fertility. Fertility was important because if you're like a farmer, you want what? Fertile crops and fertile cattle. And so they were worshipped because of that, and they were attractive to the people. Get this. I don't know if you can imagine this or not, but imagine this. A religion that attracted people because it promised material blessing. What? Now, they didn't have TV or gold furniture back then, but if they did, I'm just saying, there might have been some prosperity Baal teaching. There we go. There's a picture that was missing in action last time, Baal and Ashtaroth. That's the female version of a Baal. And so they would pair them together because this whole weird fertility, erotica, prosperity kind of teaching that was attractive to people living in the land who are trying to scrape out a living and wanted their crops to grow. Everybody here? All right. And then I wanted to add this because I do that sometimes. The pursuit of material abundance and social stability are always a danger to the covenant people at any time and in any society. When you're chasing after some religious teaching or attracted to some preacher because he promises you wealth and abundance, I'm just thinking, that might not be a good idea. That might look like a golden calf or the bull from Wall Street. I'm not sure. All right, let's go. What else? They worship the sky, the earth, the sun, the moon, all the heavenly entities. They worship. There was a god of the sun, a god of the moon. They pretty much served as rulers or guides of what we would call, not the underworld, the netherworld. The netherworld is just whatever's on the other side of this life. So they believed in life after death, obviously, as we've talked about worshiping ancestors. And so the sun god and so forth were the guides or the rulers of that netherworld. And then another thing I'm going to touch on, and I'm giving you all this because you're going to bump across these things as you're reading through 1st and 2nd Samuel. There are different episodes that are involved with these that'll make a lot more sense if you at least know what the custom is, okay? Necromancy, I don't know if you heard of that, but that's the practice of consulting mediums and conjuring up the dead. It's like, I don't know, again, if they had TV, perhaps they could have shows about mediums and conjuring up the dead and ghost hunting and things like that. But they would do it, especially back then, they would do it for the purpose of gaining knowledge about the future. So they believe I could go to these spiritual mediums or witches, or warlocks in the case of a male, and they would conjure the spirits of the dead and give us information about things to come. Now here's the deal. Like in Israelite religion, the covenant people, God is very specific about you don't do that stuff. Don't play patty cake with demons. Bad idea, my people. Everybody tracking here? I'm just thinking that if you go to a demon for wisdom, he might just lie. He might just be bent on pulling you away from the truth. Just a thought. That's why, if you remember, how many have read these before? How many know the Witch of Endor story? All right, if you don't, you'll read it when you go across the Witch of Endor. Saul is the king of Israel. All right? Saul's the king of Israel, and he's been doing okay. He's been doing some things. And he's cast out. Actually, he's cast out all the mediums and the witches and so forth that have been cast out of the land. And then he gets in this pickle where the Philistines are starting to gather, and he gets nervous. He like hits the panic button. And so he goes, he's like, find me a medium. I need to know, like what's going to happen here. And so he goes to a medium. She conjures up the day, she's doing her like crystal ball thing, only like it actually happens. Ah! And she freaks out because like for real now. And who should pop up of anyone but Samuel the prophet? It's like, you're trying to get away with something and you turn the corner and there's your dad. Samuel the prophet pops in and he's the dude that she freaks out. Samuel pops up and he's like, Saul, what's up, dude? You can't do this. Tomorrow you'll be with me. Oh, that's a bad day. I'll just read it to you from 1 Samuel. Samuel said, why do you consult me now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and all that night. See, this is a big deal. The witch freaks out because God intervenes and does something supernatural here, and like legit for real brings up Samuel. And Samuel's like, man, I was down there, I was doing good. I was in Abraham's bosom. I'm in paradise. Me and Abe are hanging out. I'm talking with Moses. We were rehashing, telling stories. We were about to go fishing. And suddenly I'm standing up here with you. She's freaked out because she's never seen that before. Right? There's nobody in her ear going, his name is Saul. It says here on his Facebook page he has 2 kids. And now he's busted, right? So that's just one example. Where it's infected now the king. See, when you're the king, remember this whole community responsibility I told you for sin? You're the king, you're like in charge for the armies. And now because of his sin, the armies fall into the hands of the Philistines. There's a price to be paid. All right, so now I'm going to have to, real quick, here's the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel, like just some things you'll see when you go through. It starts out with Hannah. Hannah is Saul's mom, but she didn't have a kid. She's praying for a kid. She's a faithful, godly woman. She promises that if the Lord gives her a kid, she'll give the kid back to the Lord. And so that's Samuel, little child Samuel there on the right, where he's meeting Eli, the priest at that time. So here's the high priest. Hey, here's my boy. He's coming to live with you for Bible camp. And so they take him, and Samuel is going to stay with Eli. This is his training, okay? So this is like a junior Jedi. I forget what they call that in the movies, where he's a Jedi in training. Say it again? Padawan. Thank you. I knew there'd be somebody. So there's a Padawan, Samuel, with, I guess that would be Ben Kenobi. All right. So you're going to see the whole story of how Samuel comes into being who he is. And Eli, his sons are like 2 knuckleheads, and you'll read that story in there. That's not out of characteristic, right? We've seen where the priesthood gets messed up too. And we also, remember I left you in Judges where it was already kind of messed up anyways. Even the last guy we talked about, Samson, was kind of like barely good. You see what I'm saying there? Okay. And so Eli and Samuel, that story is told, so we see where Samuel comes from, what his story is. Then there's an injected story kind of in there about the Ark of the Covenant. It's kind of a cool story. The Ark of the Covenant falls into Philistine possession. The Philistines get it, and to them it's just like a magic box. And so for, I think it's about 7 months where they have it, and they take it on the Philistine world tour. And God is like, that wasn't made for them. And so God gives them a plague. Does anybody know what the plague? You know, so you're laughing. Gives them a plague of something that would require preparation H. And they're like, you can have it back. we don't want this thing. Come and get it. It's in the book. See, y'all don't read. You're like, oh, what the, huh? No, it's really in there. Okay, so Samuel, he's going to anoint Saul as king, and then Saul gets all messed up, and then he anoints David, little boy, shepherd boy David, as king. And then we get the story of David and Goliath. We've kind of already touched on that a little bit. And then, so David now is in the kind of king's court, and he's playing his harp. You remember these stories? He's like playing little things, keep Saul. Because Saul is going to lose it. Saul goes like kind of bananas. He's all insecure in his leadership. He gets fallen into sin. He's just doing all kinds. You ever work for an insecure leader? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so you take that to extremes. That's what happens with Saul. And he starts doing dumb things. And he decides he's going to kill David because obviously that's what an anointed king of the Lord would do. So now David's on the run. David has a big chunk of 1 Samuel is David running from Saul because Saul's trying to kill him because he's threatened, right? He's like, I'm threatened, my leadership is at risk here, and so I'll just kill you. At one point, he chunks a spear at David. David's like, that's a clue. I should leave town. So, for real, it's in there. I'm not even making this up. Say amen if you read it. All right, see? Okay, so now David spends a big chunk of his younger, early 20s running from Saul. And then Saul does what anybody in that situation would do, and he gets a job working for the Philistines as a mercenary. He goes to work for the Philistines as a mercenary, and he recruits some mighty men to go raid villages with him. Have y'all read the story or not? I'm just trying. It's a big chunk. This is what's happening. He's a mercenary for the Philistines. And they're paying him to go raid villages. All right. He's just trying to wait for Saul to die. He has opportunities to kill Saul. He doesn't take it. Amen. All right. Don't make me talk about what Saul was doing in the cave. I'm just telling you, the Bible's a real book. They didn't have outhouses back then. Next. Saul dies. And David becomes king. It's a great story. Here's what it says. You get into 2 Samuel now, and it says this. This is important. Theologically, it's important. The Lord declares to you, that's what it says, 1 Samuel 11, or 2 Samuel 11. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. He's talking to David. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. Woo. See, now we just uprooted Saul and replaced it with David, completely different family lines. Now God's saying, David, when you're gone, it's going to be ancestor after you that I'm going to raise up. And he's the one, look what it says, verse 13, important verse, star it. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Aha! So the promise that this is a covenant. A new covenant that's being made with the house of David, that from your offspring I will establish a king who will sit on your throne and build a house for my name, and I will establish his kingdom forever. I needed some reverb right there. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. Gosh, that sounds familiar. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. See, Jesus comes from the house of David, which is from the tribe of Judah. Progression. It's the meta-narrative. You got to go all the way back into Genesis to start this thing from Abraham forward. Y'all still here? All right. So David goes on some military campaigns, and he's like a great warrior, you know, his military experience coming into bear, and they get a lot of victories, and they're winning a lot of things, they're doing a lot of great stuff, and David has a great idea. See, David's living in the city of David, which we would know as Jerusalem, and David says, hey, I like it here in Jerusalem. Why don't we move the Ark of the Covenant over? A couple of you guys go fetch that thing and bring it down here from Shiloh. And it does not go very well. It doesn't go well because they don't move it the way they're supposed to. This is demonstrating now like ignorance of the law. And it gets a guy killed as a result of it, and David's ticked off at God. It's in the book. I promise you, it's in the book. David's ticked off at God now. David's like, what? How can you kill that guy? And he just like leaves it on the porch for a little while. He's like, just leave it over that dude's house. I don't even know what to do with it. And then he calls the priests, and he's like, hey, man, you got to tell me, how are we supposed to move this thing? Because I can't be getting people killed. It's bad for my rep. And so they figure out how they're supposed to move it. And David does this, like, amazing thing, you know, where he's sacrificing to the Lord every 6 steps. And they've got the priests carrying in the big worshipers, this big, huge procession. And David gets all carried up in worship. And he's like, whoa, it's hot. And he starts throwing off his clothes. It's in the book. And so David, after Ark Gate, finally get that cleared up. He gets home and he's got to deal with his wife. His wife gate. David's got marital problems now. Like, first the king wanted to kill me, then God's mad at me, and now, you know, the Ark thing, and now I get home finally, like this big, great day for us, establishing worship in Jerusalem, and now my wife's giving me a hard time because I don't look dignified. So he just casts her aside. Oh, here's the thing. Oh, by the way, that's Saul's daughter. He won her. He did. He won her for killing Goliath. Oh, yeah. This is a great story. I need more time with y'all. Michal is Saul's daughter that David won by killing Goliath. This is his prize. But Saul decided to kill David, so David was like on the run for a long time. And Saul told her, hey, you can go marry another dude. So she did. And you know what? She had a family and was happy. And Saul was dead, and David came back and said, you, better do it this way. Stay out of trouble. you belong with me. And forced her to leave her husband and family, whom she was happily married to come be his wife. Because I'm the king now. So she didn't really like him to begin with. Like, my dad gave me to you, and I don't even like you. Oh, I hate you. So there's that whole incident. You'll read about it. I feel sorry for her. She's a bad guy in the story, it seems. But you should, if you understand the backstory, like, she's a victim. All right. So after Wife Gate gets dealt with, then we got Bathtub Gate. That's Bathsheba Gate. Right? Y'all know the story? He's watching Playboy TV. He's supposed to be off at war. But, you know, he's there. You know, everybody else is in bed. How'd that get there? The first pop-up. So, like, now he's off the reservation now because he's going to have Bathsheba gets pregnant. Oops. Well, how do we cover this up? I know. I'll just kill your husband. Yeah. Yeah. So now he's guilty of adultery and murder. And Nathan, the prophet, the new guy, Samuel's gone, right? Nathan comes on the scene. He tells him this little parable. He's like, isn't this terrible what this person did? And David gets all indignant. Oh, my goodness, yes. That guy, bring that man before me. Off with his head. And Nathan says, you demand. Not demand, but demand. You demand. Guilty. And then David's a mess, man. I love David. He's got all kinds of family problems. I'm not even lying. His daughter Tamar gets raped by his son Amnon. That's kind of a big deal. And then his son Absalom gets mad, so he kills Amnon. And since David didn't do anything about Amnon, Absalom gets mad at David, and Absalom, David's son, stages a religious coup to take the kingdom from his dad. No. Father-son fighting? Say it isn't so. Rebellious children? What? No way, because David was a godly man, so, everything's supposed to go perfect for him. Tell that to Absalom. And then David gets all right. We deal with the Absalom situation. And then David does something dumb, and he takes a census. And you would say, what's the big deal about a census? And it ties back in to realpolitik. Folks, listen to me. That is a mega theme of your Bible, and if you don't get it, you don't get it. Realpolitik is leaning on man-made military, political, and social systems. And in this time in history, the only reason you take a census is to force people into military service, to brag about the size of your kingdom, and to begin taking taxes. And God told him, don't do that because I'm giving you a period of peace. It's going to be peace in the land. I'm going to give you rest from all your enemies. But David just wants a little insurance policy just in case. And so God gets mad at this is realpolitik, folks. God moves in and says, it's not how my kingdom works. So, you're the king of Israel. Just like Saul, you're responsible. And you bear a burden for your sin that will be excised on the entire nation. Communal worship, communal sin. So here's your choices, David. Behind door number 1, 3 years of famine. Behind door number 2, 3 months of defeat or running from your enemy, in other words, military defeat, or 3 days of plague. What will you have? Those are your choices. Choose. And God says, please don't leave me in the hands of an angry God, and don't leave me in the hands of my enemy. And so it says that as a result, there were 3 days of plague that swept through Israel. And you think, 3 days, that's not too bad. Except they didn't have doctors and hospitals and inoculations and immunizations. And so in those 3 days, 70,000 people died. That's a bad plague. 70,000 people died. Here's what it says. When the angel, this is a death angel coming through. When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, so the plague is spreading, right? 3 days, rapid, outbreak. The Lord relented concerning the disaster and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, enough, withdraw your hand. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of, I meant to look up how to pronounce that, but I don't even know. So I'm going to give him a name. Aaron. At the threshing floor of Aaron, the Jebusite. Here's what it says. When David saw the angel who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I have sinned. I, the shepherd, have done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my people. Now lock into that because there's theology packed in that too. Because he's recognizing his responsibility for the people who are suffering, and he's saying, let it come on me instead of on them. I am their shepherd. Punish me. God is going to move. That moves the heart of God. I should say it that way. That moves the heart of God when somebody steps up like that. On that day, Gad went to David and said to him, Gad's a prophet, go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Aaron, the Jebusite. So David went up as the Lord had commanded through Gad, and when Aaron looked and saw the king and his officials coming toward him. Okay, so you're like a farmer, threshing floor, right? Wheat farm. And his officials, here comes the king of Israel. Coming toward him, he went out and bowed before the king with his face to the ground. He's a Jebusite. Like, that's not good. He's not an Israelite. Okay. And there's the king of Israel. Aaron said, why has my lord the king come to his servant? So he's like, I don't want to fight here. To buy your threshing floor, David answered, so I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague on the people may be stopped. And he said to David, let my lord the king take whatever he wishes and offer. It's all yours, man. I'm good. We're good here. Take it. Here are oxen for the burnt offering. Here are the threshing floor sledges and ox yokes for the wood. Your majesty, I, your servant, give all this to you, the king. And he also said to him, may the Lord your God accept you. But the king replied to him, no, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. See, worship has a price. You can preach that to yourself. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. Now that's like a gazillion dollars. This is like 3,000 years ago, okay? David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered his prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel stopped. That's how the book ends. But listen, here's the deal. Okay, this threshing floor. Threshing is how they would sift the grain. They would sift it on the threshing floor in order to get the grain to make bread and such. And here, this Jebusite guy owns this threshing floor, this piece of land right outside of Jerusalem, or right outside of David's city. Let me say it that way. And David goes at the order of the Lord and purchases that piece of land for 50 pieces of silver. And he buys it. So it is now the possession of the king of Israel, who builds an altar to worship the Lord there to stop the plague from affecting the people. That plot of land is the Temple Mount. It is on that plot of land that David sets aside, having built an altar there, to build the temple. David himself doesn't get to build the temple, but Solomon does. Solomon's temple is built on the threshing floor that David bought for those 50 pieces of silver. It's the same temple mound you see on the news now with the Muslim mosque sitting on it. Now do you understand some of the tension on CNN? Okay, I'm out of time. It's cool, so I'm done. David's life, I love it. It's super, super interesting, and there's so much packed in these two books. It's like your entire elementary school worth of Sunday school stories are all in there. This is like the highlight of Jewish history. This is the golden years. It's never, ever, ever, ever to this day any better for them than it is during the reign of David. David's the best of all of Israel's kings throughout all of their history. David. God established this covenant with David like he did with Moses before him and Abraham before him. It's the same story moving forward through time. David. But David, here's what I love about David. He's a stinking mess. He's the youngest kid. He's forgotten about by his dad. He's left out on the backwoods, fighting off bears and lions, trying to gather some sheep. He's a little ruddy kid that brings lunch out to his brothers, that fights a giant with a rock, that gets chased away by the king and spends his early adulthood as a mercenary fighting for the enemy, who comes back to reclaim his wife that hates him, who has all these family issues that are going around, got his own internal struggles, guilty of adultery and murder. Not killing, murder, different. Now murder, intent and purpose. Daughter raped by son. Son killed by other son. That son tries to kill you and take the kingdom. You screw up, do what God tells you not to. 70,000 people die in the land as a result of your sin. right? Up and down. He's real. He's real. He's not perfect. The Bible does not ever set up any human as the perfect person until Jesus. But here's the thing about David. This is what should encourage you. How many ever feel like, I screwed up? I done some things I shouldn't. I'm not sure God would use me. Read the story of David. Did you kill 70,000 people? Because here's what. After removing Saul, he made David their king, and God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to. You know what David did in the end of his story? He said, don't let this fall on them. Take me instead. God says, that's it. That's my heart. That's my heart. You get it. He says, from this man's descendants, God has brought to Israel the Savior, Jesus, as he promised. See, in Jesus' lineage are screwed up people like David. There's prostitutes. There's people just like you and me, flawed. But none of that matters. It's the heart. So regardless of what you've been through, and regardless of what you've done or haven't done, or how bad you think you are, none of that matters when you come before him and just say, I love you. Use me. And he will, because that's his heart. Let's pray.